A man insulted Vladimir Putin in first class, but immediately regretted it when the truth was revealed. Sergei Dimitrov, a Russian businessman in his 40s, used to take first-class international flights, often between Moscow and Paris, for deals that were of little interest to him but were essential to strengthening his business relationships. His world was one of big deals, partnerships, and global summits. His first-class trips had become a ritual, a luxury parenthesis in a daily life made of figures and strategies. That day, as he boarded the plane, Sergei felt that same routine enveloping him. He crossed the bridge with his arrogant posture, a slight smile on his lips, sure of his status. The flight attendant's smiles were polite, but he expected no less. He was a regular. A regular for private lounges and leather seating, gourmet meals and fancy cocktails. He sat comfortably in his chair, adjusting the small wooden table to place his glass of champagne. The crystal clicked lightly, and he looked out the porthole thoughtfully. The hustle and bustle of the airport seemed to fade away as the plane took off, carrying him towards a temporary tranquility, far from the tense negotiations that awaited him in Paris. He already imagined himself at the top of the tower, attending investment discussions, but for now he was just a privileged passenger, sheltered from the problems of the world. Sergei observed the other passengers, casting absent-minded glances at the faces he passed. As always, he spotted the trappings of status. The fine jewelry, the tailored suits, the expensive watches. A few crossed glances, a few agreed smiles. But none of them really interested him. First class was often full of people like him. Businessmen, diplomats, oil tycoons or quiet financiers, moving between European capitals, lost in the whirlwind of their own concerns. However, this flight seemed different. A man sat next to him, a figure not immediately distinguishable from the crowd. He wore a dark wool coat, simple but of unquestionable quality. He seemed not to be seeking attention, unlike other passengers who strutted around in their ostentatious wealth. This middle-aged man exuded a tranquility, a serenity almost unexpected in such a worldly and energetic environment. Sergei looked at him for a moment. He didn't even need to examine him in detail to realize that this was a man who could easily be forgotten in a crowd. At least, apparently. A cursory glance was enough for Sergei to tell himself that it was probably another businessman, a retiree perhaps, or one of those second-rate diplomats who spend their time accumulating air miles. He raised an eyebrow, a slight mocking smile on his lips, before looking away. But little by little, as the plane rose into the sky, an inevitable boredom set in. Sergei sought to fill this void. Social discussions bored him, and the files he had taken with him were of much less interest to him than a futile conversation. So he turned to his neighbor with a smirk, ready to break the silence. He had always cultivated an image of success, an image that had to be maintained at all costs. He wasn't the type to start friendly conversations, no. Every word he spoke was calculated, measured, like a brick in the construction of his image. His arrogance was not only a consequence of his professional success, it was a weapon, a means of remaining among the elite, an elixir of power that reinforced his authority. "You know this Putin, he's unbearable," he said without preamble, glancing at his neighbor with a slight twinkle in his eye. He expected acquiescence, or a small talk like the one he'd had hundreds of times. "He has led us all into political chaos, the economy into the trash, and he won't stop behaving like a tyrant." He looked down for a moment, internally mocking the power of this president whom he hated. "I don't know how he manages to stay in power this long, honestly. It seems like he has a pact with fate." He let out a bitter laugh, a note of defiance in his voice. "But hey, he's like that. He does what he wants, and the rest of the nation follows, blindly." He paused, thinking he had found common ground, a point where his neighbor might perhaps, out of politeness, nod in agreement. After all, this was what he expected, a reaction consistent with the social rules he mastered so well. But hey, I guess a man like him is beyond the reach of criticism. If he had any sense, he would have resigned by now. His tone became lighter, almost condescending, as if he were minimizing the impact of his words. He already saw himself at the top of the ladder, dominating the political game he denigrated. But he was even more convinced of his right to irony, convinced that his status as a businessman and his privileged position in first class exempted him from any repercussions. His neighbor, however, did not respond immediately. On the contrary, he just stared at the horizon, his gaze lost in the blurred landscape behind the porthole. Sergei raised his eyebrows, surprised by the man's silence, but he told himself that he was just another passenger tired from frequent travel. The old people, these men who no longer had anything to prove, must have been trying to escape the agitation. This lack of response only inflamed Sergei's ego. He took this as an invitation to say more, to deploy his criticisms with more bite. He's the kind of man who doesn't take any criticism, who shuts everyone up with his little plots, he said in a louder voice, as if he wanted each word to hit harder than the last. He let out a sarcastic laugh, certain that his neighbor was unlikely to challenge anything. And Russia, well, it's caught in this spider's web that he's spun around us. He makes it seem like everything is under control, but it's all a game of manipulation. Sergei turned his head and glanced furtively at the other passengers, observing the frozen expressions of a few. He knew they were attentive to him. They listened to him, tacitly approved his opinions without ever daring to intervene. After all, he was a man of influence. He had no need to justify himself. His words, as sharp as they were, didn't bother anyone. At least, that's what he thought. As the flight progressed, Sergei's confidence grew. Alcohol and fatigue had softened his inhibitions, and he felt in great shape. It was his playground. He was the master of it. He let loose more, chaining together more intense criticism, listing conspiracy theories about the president, insinuating secret manipulations behind each movement. He spoke about the attack on the opposition, the propaganda, how the media was controlled and dissenting voices silenced. With each sentence, he felt more powerful, more in control, a condescending smile playing on his lips. Each theory he threw out became more outlandish, but Sergei didn't care. He was above reproach, above the unwritten rules of society. He sometimes glanced sideways at his neighbor, waiting for a reaction, but he remained impassive, frozen in his silence. For Sergei, it was a quiet victory. He had emptied his bag, without opposition, on this flight where he felt invincible. But soon a strange change occurred in the cabin. He began to see furtive glances, curious eyes turning in his direction. There were many of them, more than he had initially noticed. Sergei blinked, trying to understand. A subtle uneasiness crept into him, a strange feeling he hadn't anticipated. The passengers around him had suddenly stopped talking among themselves. Some smiled shyly, but with a certain respect in their eyes, as if they made it a point to be pleasant. The atmosphere grew denser, and Sergei felt a shiver run down his spine. He brushed the feeling away with a simple wave of his hand. After all, he was Sergei Dimitrov, a man of power. Why worry? He knew this kind of behavior well. Simple curiosities, nothing more. But something was wrong. His thoughts were interrupted when he saw a group of men in security uniforms slowly approaching him. They walked with a measured, almost ceremonious step, and as they approached, Sergei sat up straighter in his seat, a little unsettled. The cabin crew moved in a discreet but synchronized ballet, beginning to cheer silently, as if something remarkable was happening. Sergei froze, a hint of worry touching his mind. Why all this attention? Why did he, a simple first-class businessman, receive such a welcome? Then suddenly, the curtains at the front of the cabin moved slightly and a procession of photographers burst in. They crowded around the man next to Sergei, their cameras crackling wildly. Sergei watched, stunned, as the flashes came on, and several visibly excited hostesses surrounded him with a respect that bordered on adulation. A slight dizziness took hold of him. The gazes of the passengers, who until then had seemed averted, were now fixed on the man next to him. Their respect was palpable, almost reverential.
Sergei's heart sank suddenly.
He sat up with a start, his throat closing as he realized that something was beyond his control. Why all this attention? At that moment, the middle-aged man stood up slowly, slow, almost measured movements, and Sergei felt a sudden warmth fill his cheeks. He realized that, without realizing it, his eyes had naturally drawn towards this discreet man, like an elusive presence that he had never really examined. And then, in a sudden realization, everything became clear. He realized that the man he had ignored, almost erased from his consciousness, was far more important than any leader he had ever met. He was Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia. Sergei stood frozen in place, his mind refusing to comprehend the extent of the situation. Camera flashes flashed around him, flashing like lightning, and the air, suddenly denser, seemed to suffocate him. He could barely hear the noises of the other passengers or the voices of the staff who were beginning to disperse around the president. All that echoed in his head were the words he had said a few minutes earlier. A man like him would do well to resign. The thought, distant at first, now became unbearable. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing the extent of his arrogance, his blind contempt for a man he had not even had the shadow of recognizing. Irony, cruel and implacable, fell on him like a blade. He, Sergei Dimitrov, a businessman who thought he was at the top of the ladder, had just found himself insulting the leader of one of the most powerful nations in the world, without having the slightest idea. The humiliation he felt was unbearable, but that was not all. He had broken the golden rule of the powerful. Never judge, never allow yourself to despise someone about whom you know nothing. And there he had just crossed the line. The cold look Putin gave him at that precise moment was like a soundless slap. The president's eyes, so inscrutable, seemed to pass through Sergei's soul, probing every thought, every pride that he had exhibited without reservation. The world around Sergei was frozen in an oppressive silence. He no longer knew where to hide, or how to face this look. It was not simply a look of reproach, it was that of a man who knew everything, had seen everything, and who, with a single brilliant, icy expression, sent Sergei in his place. Sergei tried to open his mouth, to make an excuse, an attempt at redemption. But the words stuck in his throat, as if the air had become too dense to breathe. The pride, the vanity of his words were frozen in a too tight knot. There was no going back. Before he even had time to make a sound, security members, discreet but relentless, had moved forward to escort him. Sergei felt pressure on his shoulders, a firm hand that pushed him gently, but with decisive force, out of the field of vision of the other passengers. One of the security guards looked at him neutrally, as if it were just a procedure, and Sergei knew it was already too late. He had crossed a threshold that he could not return to.
Not a word, not a reaction, just laden silence.
The other passengers remained frozen in various attitudes. Some seemed almost amused by the scene, their faces marked by a stifled smile or mischievous curiosity, while others exchanged whispers in low voices, as if trying to digest the absurdity of the situation. Sergei could hear the whispers, like background noises mixing with the beating of his heart. He knew he had just experienced one of the deepest and most degrading humiliations of his life, but more than that, he realized he would never be forgotten. He would have a hard time getting rid of the image of that moment, of that icy look from Putin that would forever mark his mind. As Sergei was escorted away, a haze of shame enveloped him. His arrogance had trapped him. He had believed, in his security as an influential member, that his power, even temporary, could justify everything. And he was wrong. He was just a pawn in a game much bigger than himself. He had fallen into the illusion of his own invincibility. In fact, he may have been more than the others. He had insulted a man he thought was within his reach, a man he believed was open to his criticism. But this man was not like the others. Putin was not just a president. He embodied a power that Sergei could not imagine, even in his moments of greatest arrogance. Outside the airport, a dark limousine waited. A procession of men in suits crowded around Putin, ensuring that no detail was left to chance. Sergei, for his part, found himself alone, exiled from the scene, a small, insignificant figure in a world he no longer understood. He no longer had the slightest idea of what was happening around him. Everything had become blurry, like a dream that fades in the morning. The humiliation was deep, and he could not defend himself, could only stand there, frozen, while the man he had denigrated for no reason left the scene in icy elegance. The lesson he had just learned was cruel, but essential. You can never judge a book by its cover, even less when you find yourself facing a man whose decisions govern an entire country. And above all, in this world where appearances are often deceptive, we had to remember that humility is the virtue of the wisest, and that the arrogance of those who believe they are at the top is their greatest weakness. Sergei, from now on, would never forget it.